All right. So, hello, Kostas.
Hello, hello, hello.
You've been working with APIs for quite some time, I understand. And I was wondering if you could share, in your experience, what would be the three main challenges that businesses would face when implementing APIs at scale?
That's a very, very interesting question, and I think it's very hard to narrow it down to only three because I think there
Okay.
are
I'm happy if you
quite
want to
more
share
challenges.
20. It's all challenges and challenges and challenges. That's what I'm hearing, guys. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, of course. So I will take as an example SendCloud, where I work, and we are mainly API driven, even for our own UI, obviously. And I can share some of the challenges we faced creating APIs at scale. So basically, our API started a couple of years ago when the development department was quite smaller, and the organization itself. And our APIs were mostly meant to drive our UI interface of our product. Now, fast forward, we started exposing those APIs as APIs for our consumers. It was mostly being done like, maybe we could just expose this as well to help some of our customers. Um, they started getting traction, but there was never a proper API governance and no proper guidelines of, how do you build your API? How do you ensure that you don't break your existing APIs? How do you move forward with versioning and etc. And I think one important thing for companies to realize is that if you're just starting, it's a pretty much good investment to allocate time and think of all the small details that consist and exist around API design and development. If you're a company that has already started its adventures in API, there's again, I think, a strong need to bring that governance within your development department. And I will explain why. Because one of the first challenges we faced was, first of all, there was no API enablement team. So there were no clear guidelines of how you should be doing it. There were also no proper guidelines on how you document your APIs, because that's also quite important, especially if you're exposing those APIs for your consumers. So our first challenge as API enablement team within SendCloud was how do we document all of those APIs that exist, and especially some of the legacy APIs that we had, because those were probably at least some of them created by developers who were no longer part of the company. And obviously they were maintained by newer developers, but they had also maybe a few questions here and there how things are working. So on that part, we took the decision to create the guidelines, which I think is very important. Even if it sounds very simple, I think it's really crucial to clearly specify how your APIs should be described and how your APIs should be built. The next challenge for us was, how do we do this in a department which consists of about 100 people in terms of the development department? Should it be something centralized? Should it exist close to the code? So we took a brave decision there, and we decided that we're going to centralize it for starts. And the reason behind that, because I've been asked quite a lot of times from developers, even within the organization, but why do we have everything centrally located? The reason
And
for
when you
that,
say centrally, what do you mean specifically?
I mean the specifications, the documentation. So we adopted Open API specification as our, let's say, documenting API tool.
Hmm.
And then we had to make a decision if those specifications would follow the services. So you would have the specification close to each service, or if we would have a central repository of handling all the specifications in one place.
Mm.
Um, Also, I need to probably note that most of our APIs are existing APIs and for quite a few years. So we do have obviously new APIs landing, but the majority of the documentation was evolving as well, APIs that already existed for more than 5 to 7 years. Now the question was, me being as a developer as well, why would you centralize something like that? One important thing for us for doing the centralization was to ensure that developers understand the guidelines and they understand how they write the Open API specification. So by centralizing our specifications, we allowed the API enablement team, which is the team I work with, to educate and to mention as well to developers what needs to be corrected, what needs to change. And it also helped us as well to onboard tech writers, because I think it's equally important to mention that when you're documenting your APIs, you need to ensure that your APIs are understandable, more especially from the public part of the world. So first of all, I think documentation, it's a challenge because also developers are not always very keen on writing documentation. I think most of the people who have been developers, when it comes to the part of documenting things, it feels a bit, a tedious process or a boring process. So by, again, centralizing that part, we kind of force them to do that and to understand why they're doing that. By doing that, then we kind of like realize that you need to start thinking as well, how do you test your APIs properly, especially in an environment where you're splitting from a monolith, because this is kind of the phase that we are within SendCloud, going from a big monolith to splitting that monolith to smaller services. And then your Open API specifications are also very critical because it's a reference documentation for teams that probably need to consume your service, but also it's, let's say, the source of truth in the API design first approach, at least, of the implementation of your provider and also your consumer. So another challenge, which I think it's quite big as well in terms of like, if you've started your product development way back and then you start considering how you can improve the quality of your APIs, is API testing. And if we take on top of that, the amount of information that is available, it becomes a bit tricky because there are lots of people that tell you, you need to test your APIs, you need to, let's say, structure your testing strategy with a classic pyramid of unit testing, integration testing, and etc. But when it comes to APIs, and especially when you have different styles of APIs, I mean, like, instead of a monolith, you have multiple services that combine and create an API ecosystem. It becomes really difficult to dig out all this information. And one example, for instance, in SendCloud is that we have, I think, more than 1,500 fixtures only on unit tests, because it's a complex product in terms of what it's doing and how we connect between our services or our integrations, our external integrations. So that was another big challenge, and how we started tackling it, because I'm not going to say we tackled it, we are in the phase of moving forward with that, was with a mix of contract testing and integration testing, generating virtual services, and moving forward with that. The final part, I would say, the third, let's say, challenge I would see there is that
today's episode is sponsored by Traffic Parrot. Traffic Parrot is a service virtualization, API mocking, and system simulation tool for microservice architectures. It will help you mock and simulate APIs and services so that you can test your applications and microservices without worrying about test data setup or environment availability. It will help you accelerate delivery, improve quality, and reduce time to market. It helps you unblock testers and developers waiting for APIs, speed up setting up test data, eliminate the need for scheduling time on environments, and also enabling your team to write hard to automate tests. So go ahead to trafficpower.com and start your free trial now.
How do you ensure that your APIs actually provide the proper business value? And how do you ensure that your APIs are being consumed and adopted? Now, that's the tricky part because it's not that technical. It becomes technical, but it's mostly for having product come to development, because APIs shouldn't be driven by developers. They should be driven by product. So product is the key stakeholder on this, because it's the interface as well to your consumers, to your customers. And that was an interesting challenge. How do you explain to people what an API is, how it builds, why it needs always to be backwards compatible, and ensure that you don't break the
And when you say people, you mean the developers, product, both?
All of them. I think in an API world, and I'm really happy to see that at least in SendCloud, you get from the CEO, from the co-founders, up to the last moving part, or I wouldn't say last moving part, but every moving part of the organization needs to be involved, because product is going to provide you the view, the roadmap, where they want to head, so you can start thinking as a developer as well how you can provide the value to that. Partner management are going to give you the feedback from probably your major stakeholders. So we do have partners within SendCloud. We're B2B, but also B2C. And you even get the founders, because the founders are the people who drive the vision of the company for the future, and they're about to tackle all the challenges, because let's not forget that we are in a period where things are very weird. You have inflation, you have pandemics, and these are kind of the problems that the big boys are there to tackle, and we are there to help moving forward. So I think that part in API is a challenge, because you need to ensure that everyone is on board and understands what is happening and how we move forward.
So I'm actually curious, because you've mentioned, I might have misinterpreted it, so correct me if I missed something here, but there is a part of this API roadmap that kind of helps with maybe the recession that we're heading into or might be into, or is it, have I misinterpreted something? Is it a new product that you're going to be, trying to, help the company with, or something like that, or your clients with?
I think the roadmap obviously shapes based on the vision and the predictions that people make. I'm not talking only about SendCloud, but for any of the organizations. So basically, if we step back and think what was happening during the pandemic, was that a great number of, let's say, businesses shifted to an API mentality. And the reason for that was that, you did have businesses that couldn't have this physical connection anymore with their consumer or customer, and they needed to find a new way. That, if you are already a SaaS product, is going to affect you somehow, even if you're a payment provider, even if you're a logistics provider, and especially during the pandemic, we already kind of knew, this is going to skyrocket at some point, because we predict that e-commerce and generally digital sales will go up, so carriers will have more work, but carriers will have more problems as well. So you kind of have to start thinking about that, and obviously you need to start thinking how this needs to be integrated within your code. I can give you a solid example. Now we have the fuel crisis, and what's happening right now with SendCloud is that we integrate with quite a lot of the carriers. I think the majority of the European carriers. Now, most of those carriers are adding surcharges, fuel surcharges, into their pricing. And we need to start, actually, we already started integrating these surcharges into our process, but that needs to be also clear to our consumers. So there you have an API, let's say, that responds with a price for a specific carrier. Then you get also the surcharges that this carrier will have on top. Another thing, for instance, that saved our, at least business cases during the pandemic, was that due to the traffic and the load that the carriers experienced, we started having the necessity or the requirement of, let's say, exposing to our customers what are the fulfillment days of the carriers. Like, what's the average time that the carrier will take to deliver your parcel, because our consumers really needed that. So based on that, you're always changing, you need to adapt. I'm not saying that everyone is adapting, or I'm not saying that everyone needs to completely change its product, but it's obvious that if you want to stay competitive, or if you want to match the needs and the requirements of the market, you need to adjust accordingly.
That makes sense. So we've talked about these challenges with implementing APIs at scale, and you've mentioned design first strategies. Could you talk a bit more about that, and maybe mention a few of those advantages, if you have seen any, of API design first strategy?
Yeah, of course. That's a very nice question. And I think, you always hear about this as a buzzword, like API design first, or the API code first, it's another hipster, let's say, thing. Sometimes we would even joke between us. I can give you a very solid case. As I said, I joined SendCloud back in 2015. Back at the time, we were mostly full stack developers, so we would be taking care of the backend side of the code. We would also take care of the front end side of the code. And as I mentioned, our APIs actually evolved as APIs that were being used from our UI, from the front end. Now, back in the days, because we were way smaller, it was easier because nearly every developer had its own project. Like, one developer would be working on this feature, the other one would be working on another feature, and he would be building both front end, back end. So he kind of like delivered the entire project in one go. At that time, approaching APIs with code first, it made sense, because you were the provider, you were the consumer in one case. Fast forward, and SendCloud expanded, and we started having cross-functional teams. We had multidisciplinary teams. So you would have front-enders, back-enders, because we stopped being full stack and we focused on specifics. You would have QAs, you would have product. Now, I came into one of the teams because I've worked in nearly all the feature teams of SendCloud, and they were building a new feature, a new product feature, which was not even evolving an existing one. It was completely from scratch. It was a greenfield, let's say, project. And I realized at some point that, front end was saying, we're nearly done. And because I was part of the back end, I was like, how can it be that you're done while we haven't even exposed the API? I mean, kind of doesn't make much sense. And then I realized that there was a disconnection. Although they both understood what was the focus and what was the project about, there was no further connection on the details, which is the most important part. So I started thinking
so the front end and back end were working in parallel, but there was no actually specification how they're going to communicate, at least a draft of that. So they had like ideas of how they would communicate, but what I'm hearing from you, they might have been not aligned there. What was it going to look like actually in detail?
Sorry, exactly. Exactly. And there was no contract, as we would call it, and it's actually kind of the term that is used. On top of that, then I realized, because we use the agile framework with sprints and everything, you came to the conclusion that, if you continue doing that, you just waste time, because, at some point people will need to adapt to your API, which means that if you don't have a contract upfront specifying what needs to be there and how it needs to function, you're obviously going to end up in a situation where you need to change things either on the back end side or the front end side, or even the business, to try to understand what's going on there. And that meant that, you're just wasting time. Another important thing I think that API design first brings is communication. Actually, I think that the most important part of API design first is the communication part, because if you have small teams which include different disciplines within it, it becomes increasingly difficult for these people to actually communicate. And this propagates then to the entire organization, because if you cannot, properly communicate within the development department, how are you going to communicate with the product? How are you going to communicate with finance? How are you going to communicate with marketing or whatever? So it became increasingly important to find a way and reduce this kind of like miscommunication, or increase time to reach to the market, or even product not being fulfilling the expectations of your consumers. So we introduced API design first, which meant that there was no more code first approach. You wouldn't be coding your API. You would be first discussing the API with the rest of your.
And when you're saying code first, you mean the developers used to just sit down and start writing the API by implementing it actually. And
Exactly.
what happens now, or what you've replaced it with, is you start with a contract in the open API spec, and then the teams in parallel can proceed to working towards that contract.
Exactly. And one additional problem with the code first approach is that, as developers, we're always delighted. So you're going to just say, I'm going to create this API. I'm going to add these fields because they look nice to me, or they fulfill my needs. But then you forget completely what your consumer needs. And you end up like creating APIs, which your consumer might say, oh, those are quite nice, interesting ideas, or it's a quite nice and interesting feature that you added, but I really can't make any use of it because, the logic behind it doesn't match my requirements. And then you would get an API that either probably cannot be adopted, and then people trying to figure out why it's not being adopted. So, it's kind of like a snowball effect that starts. So you lose also trust within your team, because the team believes that they're not building or they're not focusing on the proper features. This brings friction, because then product and developers start blaming each other, it's not us, it's you that it didn't provide us the proper specs. By going the other way around and having actually product drive your APIs, and having product as well participate in this process of the contract creation, you can get immediately the required input you have. And then you can clearly also communicate that, this is what we got. This is something we're launching as a beta or anything. And then you can get also extra input from your partners, your consumers, whoever is involved into this process.
That makes sense. Yeah, so I'm curious, because you mentioned that the product drives the way the APIs are shaped. So how would that look like? Do they sit down with the developers of the front-end team or the back-end team, or everybody together? How would that look like?
Yes, again, very interesting question, because I can admit that we haven't conquered the entire world, but we're shaping this process and mindset within the organization up to now. So basically, what we are interested in, actually, we're still exploring it, is like, first of all, who are our true personas, for certain APIs, so we can get the proper feedback from them. Is it like a small customer? Is it like a big customer, like a warehouse or something like that? Then what we do is we've started as well joining sessions of getting feedback from our consumers, like actually hearing them, what is working for them, what is not working. And we do it primarily as an API enablement team surrounding other teams like partner management or even UX, because even UX is now interested in APIs and wants to understand better. And then that information comes back to obviously to the product, and obviously there are the plans of the product itself from the company side, like what we want to build. It becomes a roadmap for the entire organization from the product side at least. It is then broken down to the specific domains, because we have different domains depending on the let's say segment of the product. So there is a different domain for carrier integrations, different domain for e-commerce integrations, and etc. They get the specifications, and then the team as a unit, as a group, needs to start discussing how this will look like, how it should behave, how it should work, so developers can ask the product and product can ask developers. I will say it's not a process that we have finalized or achieved 100%, but we are moving into this kind of mindset and process, and this actually makes me personally happy, but I think makes also the rest of the developers, but also even the product, more happy, because now they understand more. They do understand how the product evolves, what are possible blockers, because that's part as well into the process. Like, if we do this, we might encounter this kind of problems.
So do you guys actually, so I'm not clear on, do you charge for the API usage, or is it like, I'm curious how the product thinks about those APIs in terms of monetizing them, and how they, like, for example, prioritize work, because I imagine you've mentioned a few like distinct departments, let's say, within your company, where there's different products being exposed to your customers, which have their own APIs as well. And I imagine your team has a limited capacity, and how do you prioritize work? Which APIs are the most important to, let's say, fix or add or, improve, etc.? And where do the UX people come in and help you make them work better, etc.? Is there any tips you could share with people around that?
Yes, of course. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, there are features as well that are being driven by the company itself, not just by the consumers. So basically, product decides. Sorry for that. Product decides what is the priority in terms of the features. This usually comes from input that we obviously receive, or possible future partnerships. So during the last few years, we got even more involved with, let's say, big names of the industry in the integration level, or even the carrier level. So it's obvious that we prioritize those features in a mix of the business value of them. The other part is obviously that we're going to listen to our consumers. So if a consumer requires something, obviously we have to evaluate what's the impact for us, like, how much of value it's going to actually produce compared to the time that you're going to allocate for your API. On the other hand, one nice thing, at least in SendCloud, is that teams are pretty self-autonomous. So we do work for a product as a whole, but the teams can also come up with our own ideas based on the product input they have, and etc. So I think if you're pretty flexible into that, but you always hear your consumer and you trust the management level of your company to where you're heading and what you need to build. I think the rest is pretty much easy in terms of like, if you add these principles of like whatever you want to use, because I'm not saying that API design first is better than code first. There is, a reason for both of them to exist, and there is also a place in time for both of them to exist. Like a startup, I think code first approach is not bad, but please don't forget about the documentation. Most difficult part is that it's getting into the mentality, respecting your consumer, and your consumer can be also internal. So documentation is vital there.
The definition of done. It's like when it's the code's ready and it's being used, it's not done yet because it's not being used yet. And when your users start using it, and like you said, you've mentioned a couple of examples where there's no adoption. How ready is your API actually, right? You can question that.
Yeah, exactly.
This was amazing. Thank you, Kostas. I think people will find this very valuable. And you've got what I find really interesting is your on-ground experience. You've obviously got a lot of like depth to what you've seen, and you can see you've actually done it yourself, and you're quite transparent about not only the great wins, but also some things are still in progress, and we're improving as we go. So this is really valuable. So yeah, thanks a lot for the chat, and till the next time.
Thank you very, very much for this wonderful chat as well. And as you said, I do believe that one thing that drives our industry is to be transparent. We need to learn from each other. It's not just being competitive or, keeping very tight our secrets on how we achieve some things. And obviously, whenever I hear stories that everything, was perfect from the start, it as well based on your experience that this most probably
like we've seen enough of these projects that we know it's very, very unlikely, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And there's always things that go bad. Most of the time they go bad quite often as well, especially if you're like in these smaller companies or products that actually are in competitive marketplaces. You got to move fast, and you got to make assumptions, and you got to cut corners. Even when I work with the big companies, they still are cutting corners sometimes because let's say there's 5 companies that are releasing the same product and they say they're going to be ready in 12 months. Let's release something in 6 months. Performance not going to be great. Maybe what else can we cut corners on? And so yeah, that I think that's, like you say, that helps because you see, okay, actually we can make some maybe we can learn from that and cut corners on performance ourselves, because we're going to have tens of users to start with, not hundreds of users to start with, and we can learn from them and see an example. For example, in the API world, are they actually using the APIs the way we expected them to? And you've got 6 months more later on, since you've released it 6 months early, to figure out if the APIs are actually being used instead of releasing it 12 months late and having something perfect that nobody uses.
Exactly. And you would be surprised how many times, even now, I've encountered this thing that the team thinks that they build the perfect solution, and then they just get hammered by feedback from the consumer that they need to change quite a lot. But if you use this approach, at least as I said, the API design first, and you clearly go by the documentation, it's easier for you as well to get the valuable feedback you need in order to move forward. Even on your documentation part, I've got consumers asking, why the hell do you say we should do it like that? Because it just doesn't make sense. And honestly, it doesn't make sense for them. It makes sense for us because it's kind of an internal problem that we need to find a way to solve it, but it's not very clearly communicated on why it should be done like that. Yeah. And finally, because you just mentioned the part with we were describing that nothing is always perfect. I was just talking this morning with an ex-colleague of mine, but very good friend of mine, great developer. He used to work for SendCloud. He is now in another big company. I'm not going to name it, obviously. And we were discussing about API, and he was like, you know something, we do have API specifications in the API design first here, but you will be really surprised that, sometimes they just say, no, don't do that. Just, cut this part of the documentation or whatever, move forward so we can deliver fast. And it's surprising because it's a very big name in the industry.
Kostas, thank you so much. I really enjoy how I genuinely enjoy this conversation, and I think it's a sign that of your deep expertise. I've learned certainly a few things from you today, and I'm looking forward to the next chat.
Me too. Thank you very, very much.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Today's episode was sponsored by Traffic Parrot. Traffic Parrot is a service virtualization, API mocking, and system simulation tool for microservice architectures. It will help you mock and simulate APIs and services so that you can test your applications and microservices without worrying about test data setup or environment availability. It will help you accelerate delivery, improve quality, and reduce time to market. It helps you unblock testers and developers waiting for APIs, speed up setting up test data, eliminate the need for scheduling time on environments, and also enabling your team to write hard to automate tests. So go ahead to trafficpower.com and start your free trial now.